Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Carla, and today I'm going to basically discuss the female menstrual cycle and better ways to train and eat and do all the things around a naturally cycling female. And I think this is pertinent for so many female athletes and also for people who coach female athletes, because a lot of this information has not been really conveyed to the public, and a lot of it is newer information as well. So with that, we'll get my screen shared and we'll get started. All right. So this is all about understanding your monthly cycle. So a startling statistic is that 6% of all exercise physiology related research is done on women. And that's sad because we make up about half of the population. And a lot of us are going to question why. Why is this the case? Well, they think women are expensive. Women are less likely to engage in research studies. And I say we're more expensive because if you're going to start a research trial and you're going to go for 1 month, if you're starting on day 1 or day 14 or day 27, whatever date you're starting on your cycle, they'll end up essentially having to run the women's study twice as long as the men's study in order to get all the women on the right part of their cycle, as it'll take about that long for them to go through their cycle. And so there's a number of reasons why, and that doesn't mean it's right, but it means that now that you know about it, maybe we can do something about it. I'm just gonna throw out a little example. I recently had a high school student need to talk about some dietary things in her health class. And so she asked me, she had to have an argument against a keto diet. So actually, if you look up research, most of it will be on men. And a lot of times the men aren't active men. There are some. But if you do like peer-reviewed lit research, the studies that are done on women, they're not on active women. They're done on overweight, like obese women over the age of 50, or women with polycystic ovarian disease. And so, yeah, so it was pretty easy to have an argument against that for women. We'll get into the physiology of why later, but there's just a great example of, yeah, there's really not much out there for women. So how do you really go off of a lot of that? And so a lot of the work that I'm doing here today is actually coming from, and I'm basically kind of telling a lot of what she has researched, is Dr. Stacy Sims. She's written a book called Roar, and her kind of favorite tagline is, "Women are not small men. We are, in fact, very, very different than men." So just a couple of things to note about key points we'll discuss. I just wanted to let you know that your period does not have to be a curse when it comes to your performance. In a recent lit review of high-level female athletes, naturally cycling women had better performance outcomes than those on oral contraceptives, which is cool. Those females on oral contraceptives that included progesterone and estrogen fared better. So if you are going to be on one, try and include the one that's just progesterone, not progesterone and estrogen. You are not a worse competitor when you're on your period. The natural fluctuations in these hormones impact your exercise metabolism and fuels you to burn and spare your plasma volume levels, how well you tolerate heat, moods, and more. And through all this research, different times of our cycles tend to mean a certain thing, which we'll go over those. But we are trainable and we can perform at any point in our cycle. And so I think we owe it to ourselves to stop being blind to the impact of our menstrual cycle. So no matter how profound or slight it might be for you, there are going to be differences. I want to let you know that you do not have to suffer in silence. You can actually manage or even master it through nutrition, smart exercise programming, so that those like PMS type symptoms, the migraines, the nausea, the bloating, the cramps, the mood swings, but they don't all have to derail your fitness goals. So we're going to go through a little of what this cycle means. And we're going to break it down from day 1 to day 28. So you can understand what I'm talking about when, so you know how to implement which types of training and nutrition guidelines when. So we're going to say day 1 through 5, yours might fluctuate slightly differently. That is when you're on your period. That's when you are menstruating. During that phase, and usually the week after leading up to ovulation, is called your follicular phase. During that time, you have a spike in estradiol and follicular stimulating hormone, but there are spikes. It's not high throughout that entire cycle. Day 14, your ovaries release an egg, and it's called ovulation. And shortly after that, you have luteinizing hormone and estrogen or estradiol that increase quite significantly. Now, they're doing that for the possibility of an implantation of that egg or fertilization of that egg to carry a baby. And now we know most cycles that doesn't happen for most women, but it doesn't mean that those hormones don't fluctuate in that way. Let's see. Scoot over. So that's kind of the big bulk of it. We're going to even make it a little bit simpler for everybody here. So when I break down the next things, you can kind of get the visual of my follicular phase that encompasses the period, ovulation in the middle, luteal phase on the back end. And on that back end, and I'll explain that's when you have that premenstrual syndrome or the PMS syndrome as well. So we're going to jump right into this follicular phase. As I mentioned, this includes your period, the ramping up of luteinizing hormone and FSH before ovulation. And generally, this is called your low hormone phase, because if you look at the graph, your hormones are relatively low for the majority of this phase. So things you need to know about your follicular phase is that in this phase, your hormones are actually favorable for performance once your period starts. Your body's no longer allocating the potential of growing a baby, and all that energy is used during the high hormone phases are now at your disposal. So you actually have the optimum performance opportunity. You are stronger during the follicular phase. One study in 20 active females found that women make greater strength gains and produce more force when they strength train during their lower hormone phase compared to the high hormone phase. You are likely to feel less pain and recover faster. I can attest to that. My Whoop always says I recover way better during my period. And another study done on swimmers found that you are likely to clock your fastest times during menstruation and slowest during the premenstrual period phase of day 21 through 28. And the other interesting thing that I thought was super crazy is that your physiology is most like a man's, and your hormone panels are most like a man's during your period. So that's when we're most like a man. And then we move on to our period, which is the first 5-ish days of your follicular or lower hormone. So I know a lot of us hate this part, but let's learn a few things about it so we can know how to train better about it. So your spatial cognition, which you use like on the basketball court to locate teammates or on the soccer field to hit a target, it is actually the strongest during menstruation and lowest during high hormone phase. So that's cool. Let's talk about GI issues. This may occur during your period as you have a hormone called prostaglandins that cause the uterine lining to shed. So they also trigger other smooth muscle, aka your bowels or your intestines, to react similarly, which can cause some GI or stomach pain or diarrhea or any of those things. So know that that's like a hormonal thing. It's not typically by the stuff you're eating, although that can trigger things, but there can be GI issues during this phase. All right, then we're gonna bust to the luteal phase, so the second 2 weeks. During this phase, as I mentioned before, this is considered the high hormone phase, and the progesterone and estrogen are the highest during this phase of your cycle. So during your luteal phase, your estrogen turns down the anabolic or growing capacity of the muscle, and progesterone turns up the catabolism or the breakdown of muscle tissue, which makes it more difficult to access amino acids, hence why we usually aren't as strong during this phase. As a result, you have higher rates of muscle breakdown during hard efforts. It's harder for us to make and maintain muscle when these hormones are high. And this is one of the biggest reasons you want to make sure that you are taking your branched chain amino acids, which would be about 5 to 7 grams daily, in addition to probably eating close to your body weight in grams of protein per day. So branched chain amino acids are considered the essential amino acids that you are unable to break down from your food. And so usually supplement form is the only way you can get this. And women actually need these more than men. So especially during the luteal phase, don't forget your BCAAs. I would say take them all the time for performance, but especially during these 2 weeks. All right, here's the downside of this part of it too. I know a lot of you have probably experienced sugar craving. Something to note, estrogen reduces your carb burning ability, likely to help you save those limited glycogen stores in case of pregnancy, famine, and emergency, while it increases fat burning and fatty acid availability. So this might be great for endurance activities, but you'll need to eat more carbs for higher intensity training. So those like cravings you get, okay, let's pay attention to that. So if you want to recover from your workouts, you'll need more carbs during these 2 weeks, 100 to 200 more calories of carbs. It doesn't mean that much, and that might be when that intra-workout carb definitely comes into play. This explains why you crave more carbohydrate foods during the high hormone phase. And if you plan on doing high intensity bouts or anaerobic leg length sprints, you'll need more carbs during this phase, as you cannot access your glycogen stores as well. Because if you don't, your body will slam on the brakes and you'll feel as though you've hit a wall. And I know all of us have probably felt that, hitting the wall. But during these 2 weeks, during that high intensity effort, you're going to hit that wall sooner than you would during the other 2 weeks. So cue the intra-workout carbs. During this phase, women actually have a harder time offloading heat in their high hormone phase of their cycle post-exercise. So you might stay warmer longer. You might have a harder time cooling down. Essentially, heat feels hotter. So progesterone actually elevates your core temperature, so you feel hotter to begin with. Your blood volume during the high hormone time accumulates, so it's harder for you to, your body to sweat and cool itself. Progesterone makes it difficult for you to shed, progesterone also makes you shed more sodium or salt, which increases your risk of heat stress, as well as hyponatremia, or lack of nutrients during exercise endurance events. So you'll need more electrolytes during endurance events during this part of the cycle. So interesting feedback from a study that Stacy described was Ironman athletes. So a bunch of women trained Ironman together, and they went to Kona World Championships. Training was all very similar, nutrition was all very similar, but about half of them completely bonked. They overheated they didn't have enough sodium in their system, and they just bogged down. The other half were like, no, it was great. It was great as planned. Well, what they found is those women who said it was great were actually during those first 2 weeks of their cycle. The ones who bogged down were the second 2 weeks. And so it doesn't mean you can't compete during that part of your cycle, but you're going to have to use different nutrition and hydration tactics during this time if you want to perform at your peak. So now we're going to wrap on that back half of the luteal phase into that first part of when you start your period. And so the PMS, or the premenstrual phase, is the last 5 to 7 days of your luteal cycle. You shift from that high hormone to that low hormone. You have a huge hormonal drop. So something to know about this, as I mentioned before, during the premenstrual part of your cycle to the sugar cravings, you'll actually need to put more carbs into your system, especially if you're doing longer bouts of exercise. It's important to note that you burn more calories overall during this premenstrual period. Studies show a 5 to 10% uptick in your metabolism in the days before you start bleeding. So hence the 100 to 200 more calories. So what I would suggest is note this, acknowledge this, grab a piece of fruit, some good like stable carbs instead of that bag of candy, because I know the chocolates and all the sugary things tend to be what spikes for so many people. This is also the period where, or the point at which you accumulate a lot of bloating. High levels of progesterone and estrogen affect the hormones that regulate fluid in your body. So estrogen increases vasopressin that is responsible for retaining water and constricting the blood vessels. Your body retains water and constricts your blood vessels, which increases your blood pressure enough to signal a drop in your plasma volume by as much as 8%, so your heart doesn't have to work so hard. That progesterone competes for the same receptor site as aldosterone, which is responsible for retaining sodium, which means less aldosterone is released. This sets off another chain of events that ultimately leads to the reduction in blood volume and a reduction in cardiac output and blood pressure, all in those 5 days before you have your period. So this is why longer endurance events are more challenging in this phase, cardiac output and challenges with fluid regulation. All right, going into that premenstrual and menstrual phase. So there's several studies that have found a reduced reaction time or neuromuscular coordination and manual dexterity during the premenstrual and menstrual phases. There's also evidence that blood sugar levels, breathing rates, and thermal regulation are negatively impacted during the time of the month, which may well account for the slight decrease in aerobic capacity during this time. So I'm going to give you a few tips and tricks how to naturally combat some PMS, and this is all from Dr. Stacy Sims. So to compensate for a shift in core temperature and body water, start drinking more electrolytes before you begin your workout during day 21 through 28. So that could mean another salt tablet, that could mean another packet of hydrate, just one more dose of electrolytes during that part. To reduce cramping, take more magnesium, omega-3 fatty acids, and the low dose of 80 milligrams of aspirin. And it must be aspirin, not Tylenol, not ibuprofen, not the other thing. Some women face headaches due to the estrogen level shift and change in blood pressure, along with the sudden dilation and constriction of your blood vessels. So in this instance, stay hydrated and eat more nitric oxide-rich foods, such as beets, pomegranate, watermelon, and spinach in the days leading up to your period. These all promote dilation of your blood vessels. So the 7 nights before your period starts, 250 milligrams of magnesium, 45 milligrams of zinc, 80 milligrams of aspirin, and 1 gram of omega-3 fatty acids. I will add in that if you have a very heavy cycle, you're going to want to start some iron supplementation at this point too. So a little bit of naturally cycling versus oral contraceptives. Some things to note is the pill seems to have a particularly ill effect on your muscle tissue and strength. In one study, women not taking oral contraceptives saw a 40 to 60% graded gain in muscle mass from training than their peers who were on the pill. Other research finds that oral contraceptives slow muscle recovery after a hard workout and may dim your aerobic capacity. There is also some research that will state that progesterone-only pills are better than estrogen and progesterone pills. There are still more studies that need to be done on that to have a really good conclusion on that. So some interesting differences on men versus women, and I think some of these are great finds. We know that men have bigger type 2 muscle fibers and the energy producing enzymes that go with them. They have higher glycolytic capacity than women, aka they can burn through more glucose or sugar in the absence of oxygen, and they will be more powerful due to this. So that helps them outperform us in short, intense bursts of effort. But it also means they accumulate more lactate and need longer recovery times for their efforts. Women have the greater advantage in endurance world as we have more type 1 fibers, and they are much more efficient at using fat as a fuel and sparing glucose. Women are more likely to sweat out excess amounts of sodium and are likely to eat into their muscles for energy. We have a harder time rebuilding and repairing those muscles after exercise during the high hormone premenstrual time in the cycle when progesterone is high. So we need to make sure that we have our protein intake really up there, actually way more than men, because our bodies just naturally break that down the second 2 weeks. Women actually mobilize more fat during exercise, but the opposite is true of recovery. After a workout, women tend to burn more carbs, and men, they burn more fat. Fat burning post-exercise metabolism drops back to normal after about 3 hours for women after they've completed their workout, whereas men can remain elevated for up to 21 hours later. Hence, men can drop more weight quickly when they start an exercise program, and physiology is a major factor for that. Women tend to sweat less, so take a male and female runner and have them run a 5K in the heat and humidity of Florida, and the female is generally going to struggle more with heat, especially during the high hormone phase. We just can't get rid of the heat as well as men can. Interesting stat on at elevation. Men tend to use more carbs as exercise fuel at a high altitude compared to sea level, and women burned even more fat than they did at lower elevations. So since women have more fat stores at their disposal, and fat is a less limited source of energy than carbs, we actually have the advantage higher up in the mountains. So when women drop too low in carbs, it causes a drop in estradiol, so our female sex hormone, with a rise in estrone, one of the 3 estrogen hormones that fat tissue secretes, which signals your body to store more fat. And the stress hormone cortisol, progesterone is converted into cortisol, which also signals fat storage under long periods of high stress. So essentially, when women go low carb, your body thinks famine and stores fat. Whereas when a man goes low carb, he is ready to become fight ready and lean up and increase testosterone. So essentially that low carb diet, it might work initially, and then it's going to have an adverse effect because as you learned, if you're doing activity, women need carbs and they actually need more than men. Just talk a few terms about menstrual dysfunction. So female triad is an outdated term for women who have too lean of body weight, disordered eating, and a drop in hormones. The International Olympic Committee studied this in 2014 and have recently called this the relative energy deficiency in sport, so the RED-S. Basically what it means is that relative energy or food deficiency that affects many aspects of physiology functioning, including metabolic rate, menstrual dysfunction, bone health, immunity, protein synthesis, cardiovascular, and physiological health. And so losing menstruation doesn't have to mean you're too lean, but you're likely undernutritioned, which means you're not getting the right micro and macronutrients at the right time in order to sustain a healthy cycle and have hormone regulation. All right. Well, we did this live once, and so we will skip this for right now. And I just wanted to let some of you know that I do plan on doing a 2023 perimenopausal and postmenopausal talk because I know a lot of you are very interested in that. And I hope that you are able to take this into consideration when coaching your females. Some things like to consider if you are a strength and conditioning coach. If you take their cycle, we are usually putting them on meso or macro cycles, and that cycle may mean 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, and then there's a deload or whatever that might mean. But understand for a female in that month, you might have 2 weeks where you can actually up percentages and 2 weeks where you have to drop them down, 2 weeks up a little bit, 2 weeks down. So they might have this undulation within that, and work with them on their percentages if they can't seem like they're hitting them, or if they can't hit their, different interval times. Ask them where they're at in their cycle. You might not understand it, but start asking. Another thing that I would highly, highly recommend is for women, girls, get a period tracker app on your phone and start tracking. When does it start? When does it stop? Like, when does it start? Because if you don't know your cycle, you are just guessing. And so there are many cool apps on our phones these days. If you do use a Whoop, you can actually input that information. And the other cool thing about that is a lot of the newer research that is actually in the works right now with women in sport and exercise physiology is actually research being put out by Whoop, because they found women are more likely to wear a wearable, and so that they are gathering a lot of new information on that topic. You can visit Whoop's their podcast, and they actually have a lot of new details about research that will be coming out about that. So I'm really excited to learn more about how to help the women that we train. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out about different women in different cycles and parts of their cycle, and I'd love to help you out. Have a great day.